Your most recent novel, Afterlives, just came out and finished this spring.
That's good.
I'm
so happy.
And so are we. Afterlives follows the stories of several different characters in the early 1900s in East Africa. It's historical fiction, but it's many other things as well, including a love story and a story about trauma that gets passed on from one generation to another. How would you describe the novel?
I think that's fine.
Thank you. I think this is going pretty well.
Why would I want to describe it differently? That's fine. I can't think of 2 sentences. This is difficult for, I'm sure you know this is difficult for a writer when people say, what's your book about? I know he wasn't saying that, but when they ask you to summarize it, if I could summarize it, would I have written almost hundreds of pages? I've written it. It's there.
I know exactly what you mean.
So wait a minute. The part I'm going to read is concerns one of the central figures, perhaps the central figure in the novel, a young man called Hamza, who had, he volunteered to join the Schutztruppe, the German colonial army, in some confusion. Anyway, this is after the war. He's returning to a town that he lived in, which was not necessarily his home or a happy place for him, but anyway, he's returning. Their boat rounded the breakwater in evening twilight, and then Ahoda ordered the sail lowered as he made a cautious approach into harbour. The tide was out, and he was not sure of the channels, he said. It was after the Kaskazi monsoon, and in the period before the winds and currents turned southeasterly. Heavy currents at that time of year sometimes shifted the channels. His boat was heavily laden, and he did not want to get stuck on a sandbank or to hit something on the bottom. In the end, after debating the matter with his crew, he thought it was too dark to approach the quay in safety. So they dropped anchor in shallow water and waited for morning. There were lights on ashore and a few people moving about on the quay. Their elongated shadows stretched out ahead and behind them in the gloom. Beyond the quayside warehouses, the town sprawled, and the sky was amber from the glow of the setting sun. Further to the right, the dimly lit shoreline road shaped away towards the headland, which after a while ran out to the darkness of the country. Hamza remembered that from the time before, how the road ran past the house where he lived, and how then it narrowed down to the tight aperture that opened out into the interior. Out to sea, the sky filled with stars, and a huge moon began to rise, illuminating the heaving water beyond the breakwater and the frothing crest of the reef in the distance. As the moon rose higher, it submerged the whole world in its unearthly glow, turning the warehouses and the quayside and the boats tied up alongside into insubstantial silhouettes of themselves. By then, the Nahoda and his 3 crew members had eaten their meager ration of rice and salt fish, which they shared with him, and settled themselves to rest, stretching out in a tight cluster. stretching out in a tight cluster on the sacks of millet and lentils which were their cargo. So he lay close to, listening to their conversation and their profanities and their gloomy homesick songs while the boat pitched with the surge of the incoming tide. They fell asleep almost in unison, their breaths drawing deeply a few times and then subtly falling silent. After the momentary stillness which followed their voices, the boat resumed its agonized creaking as the sea tugged and pulled at it in its unrest. He lay on his good side, but he could not prevent the pain from returning. So he drew back from the cluster of men and put some distance between them. After a while, he moved away completely, for fear of making them restless with his sleeplessness. He wedged himself into a space that provided some distracting discomfort from his eggs, and somehow he fell asleep.
Do I remember this correctly? Was that the first passage you said that you wrote for the novel, or am I making this up?
No, you're not making it up. I had been thinking of writing this book for a while, and after retiring from teaching in 2017, I had various jobs to do, and then we had this fellowship in South Africa, in Stellenbosch, the University of Stellenbosch. And I remember clearly that I sat down with it. I thought, I'm ready now, I'm ready to start this book. And I wrote that passage that I just read to you, more or less. I mean, it was probably revised, but more or less. So that's the first thing I wrote in Abdulrazak.
Were you thinking that the book would begin with that passage, or did you already know that it would be?
Well, I guess I was thinking that I wanted to follow this man, Hamza. I think that's how I began. That I wanted to follow him and to think about what it is that people who volunteered to fight in those colonial armies, what were they thinking of? When we think about it now, it seems completely mad, absurd, incomprehensible that young African people would go and join colonial armies and fight and kill each other, other Africans, for what? To see who would become their colonial rulers. It just seems absurd. Why did they say, we don't want to be part of any of this? Go away. We'll fight you. But they didn't. Many people joined the British on the one hand, all the German armies and the Portuguese armies. All the people who fought in those conflicts in Africa were Africans in the service of European colonial administrations. I was interested in that to try and see what were they thinking. So that was why, that was the beginning.
In that sense, Afterlife seems to pick up almost directly where your novel Paradise left off. Paradise, which was nominated both for the Booker and the Whitbread Prizes, came out in 1994. Did you always, after that, know that you wanted to write something that would follow up on some of the things that you wrote about in Paradise?
Yeah, it was the final moment, the final episode in Paradise is the recruiting drive. And that, again, is the first thing I wrote with that novel.
Really? The very last passage?
The very last passage was the first thing I wrote. In fact, I think I wrote that in about something like 1984. And in fact, I'm pretty sure, because I had it in a notebook where I was working at the time, and quiet moment, and I wrote that episode by hand in those old days. But I was then in the midst of writing something else, so it just stayed in the notebook there. And this is how it works often for me. Things take a long time mature. But I also, I think, began to realize that I really didn't know enough to tell that story that I had started there. I tried to read about it, but there wasn't very much available to read. What happened to those people who I've described, who joined up? I know there was, family members who had been, in this case, this is my so-called grandfather. We use terms like grandfather. I don't know if you do that here in Finland as well. But we use terms like grandfather for people of that generation. So he was really my mother's uncle. But we don't have a word for my mother's uncle, so he becomes grandfather. Anyway, he was conscripted into the German military operation as well. And he used to tell us the story. He survived, I think. Knowing him, knowing what he was like, he's dead now. Anyway, so I realized apart from those kinds of things, I really didn't know them. So I had to leave that. But also the other thing, when I came back from various other trips to Zanzibar, I was so full of, I traveled around East Africa. I was so full of this that I thought that episode that I've written about, how did that boy get there? He was 17 or 18 by the time of that final episode. So then I wrote the story of how the boy, in fact, my paradise begins with the boy first, because that was what was in my mind. And at times I thought maybe I made this up, but when I look at my notes, I see that that is indeed the first thing I wrote when I was thinking of the novel as opposed to that episode. I wrote the boy first. So I was telling myself, write about the boy first. But in the end, it sounded quite a good beginning, so I just left it. The boy first. But so then I wanted to write the story about the boy, how the boy ends up being that person who chooses to join the colonial army. But to come to your question at last, it was always a thought that one day I will want to do that. I will want to see, so what happened to somebody like him? So it's not a sequel in the sense of directly moving on, but because I imagine that the boy I was writing about in Paradise was not unique, but there were other people like him who also did that for confused reasons and joined up.
Your first novel, Memory of Departure, was published in 1987. And at the World Voices Festival in New York, you said that that novel was not only a memory of departure, but also a goodbye. You're saying goodbye to your home.
Did I say that? These guys, they find things you said.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, it was part of what I've been describing, trying to understand something about why leave? Why did I so much want to leave? And when you live in whatever circumstances you live in, you live with people, you share things, and if there are troubles, whatever, then they're shared, and the sharing makes a lot of things bearable. So even if you're short of this, you're short of that, because you're all losing, you're all kind of without, whatever it is, it feels less than it might feel if you're not used to it. And I think, therefore, being in England and away from all these things, to think about why were we living like that? Why were certain things this way? And these things might be to do with how parents treated their children, how women were denied this, whatever it might be. All the things that we think of in our imperfect societies, all the things in our imperfect lives. But when you're away from places where you can share these imperfections, they glare at you, they're subtly big. And you have to reflect and account. So it was wanting to write about that And, well, that was what my memory departure was. Wanting to write about that and wanting to write about what it was like. It was necessary, it seemed to me, to be able to say that before I wanted to say something like a crappy country here in the UK. You know? So we also have a crappy country, and this is what's crappy about it.
How did you decide that writing was the way to try and grapple with these things and try to understand what they meant for you?
Well, I didn't decide. You know, these things happen. Before you know where you are, you're doing things that you didn't really decide. I did write. And writing, I've always found, and certainly during that period, I found helpful in understanding. Actually, well, you don't know what you're doing really, or at least I didn't know what I was doing. And I do know that I was sitting there in a physics class, listening to the teacher talking about, I don't know, and I'm writing something else, you know, pretending to be taking notes, but I'm writing about something that's troubling me. So it was like this, writing was always helpful in this way. But there was a moment, I think, when I realized that I was finding this not only helpful, but I was fictionalizing. I was writing about things that I was feeling, but in imagining somebody else's life, really, and then you can make them more glamorous, or more handsome, or taller, or more athletic, or whatever. So at some point, I think it began to feel like writing a story. And then they keep growing, and then there is definitely a moment when I thought, what is this? What am I doing? And I think this is what making art, that is, if you're stumbling through it, rather than starting off from the edge of whatever to say, I'm going to be an artist. But I think this is when you realize that you're not just putting down ideas and reflections, so that you're making. And making is what art is. It's not telling things to yourself, which is what you do when you're just writing these things and working things out. But you're making something, because ultimately when you're making it, then you're imagining that somebody's going to read this. But it took a long time to be able to say, I want to be a writer. Because it seems such a huge aspiration. But somewhere in those 2 or 3 years or so, in England, then it seemed like, yeah, all right, I'll try. Like that.
And it was the combination of these personally relevant experiences and reflections, but in the context of making up, imagining lives of other people, that the combination was important for you.
Yes, it was, because even though I wrote the book Memory Departure and said that it was something to do with my departure, but actually none of those things happened to me. Exactly. My father was not the beast that is a memory departure. I did not lose a brother in a fire or anything like that. So it isn't the kind of details of the story that was sort of about what I had experienced. It's more, it's more the context, the feeling, that what was not right. And I think this is the difference. Well, that's what I mean by art, really. I think that's what I mean by when people ask, as they used to, is this sort of graphical? And they say, well, no, well, not really. No, it's not, because I use my own experience. But the whole point, I think, about art of any kind, is that it's mediated by something else. It's not your experience, or whatever it might be, but you make something else in it, you turn it into something, either by fictionalizing it, or it might be by metaphor or by whatever. So it's that, I think, that is the difference between telling your story, a memoir, and making something out of your experience.